threat of industrial strike, etc. And just to use as an example, the fire station, which is in my own constituency, Tala Fire Station, which is, I would argue, the busiest fire station in the entire country, which covers not only the very wide and dispersed part of South Dublin, but then into the city, but also Wicklow and parts of Kildare, all from this one station. And not that there are accommodation, well, there have been improvements there at long last after a lot of broken promises, but I'd be very conscious of a group of people like that who do a very excellent job, and hopefully it won't get to a stage where people would have to withdraw their labour.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you. Conclude.
I say I bring Deputy Maloney's comments to the attention of Minister Hogan. I want to say a lot of progress has been made in our fire responses. The number of fire incidents has been driven down consistently year on year, while every death obviously is absolutely one too many.
Okay.
It's a provisional toll for 2012 with 28 people lost their lives, but that is actually the lowest annual figure for fire deaths for 4 decades. I give full credit to communities themselves, as well as everybody involved in fire safety and fire services, for the work and changes which have brought about this consistent reduction in Ireland's fire death rate to this figure of approximately 6 fire fatalities per million of population. Achieving this level of community safety places Ireland in the very top league of fire safety countries, and the challenge now for all involved is to sustain this very high level of safety from fire. And again, I reiterate our big reviews to the attention of the Minister.
Thanks, Minister. Thank you. Before we resume the continuing of the morning business, I've just to read a note from the Senate. A message from Senator Aaron. Senator Aaron has passed the House of the Oireachtas Commission Amendment Bill 2012 without amendment. Now I turn to the Finance Bill. The second stage is resumed, and Deputy Catherine Murphy was in session, and 17 minutes remaining in the slot. I think you're sharing it with somebody. Yeah.
Deputy Ross.
Okay.
Just to continue where I think I've about 4 minutes left. 3 or 4 minutes. The bill also makes provision, as I was talking about job incentives. The bill also makes provision for to abolish the job assist scheme, and I'm wondering why. And is, for example, the job bridge actually replacing that? And I would hope that is not the case. People were actually taken on who were long-term unemployed on the job assist scheme. I just note a landmark case in the UK in the last week or so where something very similar to the job bridge scheme was deemed to be unlawful. Clearly, you know, these kind of incentives are really important. One of the things I was trying to draw attention to earlier was the fact that there is no real strategic focus. We're being told that there's a 2/3, 1/3 approach to revenue and cuts. Or the other way around. That was supposed to foster economic growth, but unemployment hasn't budged. In fact, it has remained stubbornly high, so that isn't working. The lack of any sort of a cohesive strategy is evident also in the current handling of the public sector reductions. I mean, what we're hearing about is we're talking about cuts in numbers and cuts in wages, but there's no real public debate, public engagement or involvement by the citizens about the type of service that we want and how we would go about paying for those services. And I believe that is a huge wasted opportunity. A recent research paper from the Nevin Institute states that we may well recover our banking system and we may well recover our international reputation, but we'll be left of a number of serious socio-economic scars from the recession. The chief one of these would be the unemployment crisis. Yes, the scope of investment is limited, but I think that there are things that can be leveraged, and I would have liked to have seen them in the bill. I think there are things that can be very targeted, like a broadband, dealing with the leaky pipes, retrofitting houses, are all things that would draw people in. And indeed, the issue of carbon tax comes up in the bill, and it's because we don't ring fence the take from carbon tax, people see it as just another general tax, and that is a missed opportunity. If it was ring fenced, yes, people I think would accept that fuel prices are increasing and the cost of heating their homes are increasing, but they would also on the other side have the possibility of reducing those costs by way of insulating their homes, and I think that that is a missed opportunity. I think SIP2, for example, have argued that that there should be a tax exemption on the pension fund levy, given that the private pension funds, which would increase the level of their investment in Ireland by 6%, and their rough calculations on that come to an investment prospect of £4.5 billion. So it's not without a decent prospect of a return. The Pension Reserve Fund, I think if it was targeted, I'm certainly not talking about throwing money at anything, but certainly targeted to job-rich growth, thank you, would be absolutely the right way to go. The take from, for example, from corporation tax or corporate tax, some of the companies who get the benefit of our human capital, like the like of Google, pay minuscule amounts of tax, and I think that some of the reasons for that are not necessarily about R&D, and they should be looked at again so as that they make a decent contribution, and they make a contribution at least to the education system that will return additional people. Somebody, and I'll finish on this, one of the people from the other side talked about the great optimism, how Moody's and the like of Standard & Poor's were very complimentary about us at the moment. I would remind people that they were the very people who were telling us that we had a great economy and our banks were AAA rated. So I'd be very careful about using those kind of sources as reliable sources, given that they got it so wrong in the past.
Thank you, Deputy Finnegan McGrath.
Carla, first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity of speaking to this important and new piece of legislation, the Finance Bill 2013. Again, at a critical time in our economic history, it's important to have a comprehensive and inclusive debate on all economic matters affecting this country and our citizens. At all times, we have to take the measured view and get the balance right at all times for the greater good of our society. Sadly, I feel this is lost in the current debates, as I feel the citizens are often forgotten about at the expense of economics and fiscal matters. In this finance bill, we deal with very important issues like the income levy, universal social charge, income tax, corporation tax and capital gains tax. These are huge issues in relation to the running of this country, and in particular at this time, and are covered in Section 1 of the legislation. In relation to the tax issue, it's important to say that we have to deal with the financial deficit while at the same time bringing some common sense politics into our taxation system, and in particular for those that pay their tax and the citizens of this state. At the moment, there is a huge sense of injustice from the people who are crying out for fairness. For example, on Monday, I met a family of a severely disabled young man who paid their taxes, paid their levies all their lives, and yet they were told that their 5-day care service for their son was cut back to 3 days per week. I already raised this matter this morning with the Taoiseach, and I ask once again, in this finance bill debate, where is the tax justice for this family? Where is the equity? If a family is tax compliant, why should they not get a decent service for their son? That's all we ask for. That's all for many people of families with disabilities ask for. They are taxpayers, they are citizens, they have rights, they deserve equality. Surely this is also a clear breach of the disability bill. It's also not fair for the family that pays their taxes. That's why I raised this issue again in this debate. When you look further into the legislation, you see that full-time workers on or above the minimum wage had their pay reduced due to the abolition of PRSI, disregarding the first €127 per week. Those on huge incomes, for example, of $500,000 per year, will suffer an identical reduction. Is that tax justice? We've also seen the household charge, or the home tax as I call it. It's now been introduced. I ask, is that a tax justice on families in the crisis at the moment with mortgages? The budget also attacked children, families, disabled, senior citizens, POI workers and social welfare recipients. Is that tax justice? Child benefit was cut by €10 per month, a broken promise. The respite care grant was reduced by €325. The prescription charge for medical card holders is up from 50 cents to £1.50 per item, with a monthly cap for a family rising from €10 to €19.50. Is that tax justice? The drug payment scheme threshold is being increased from €132 to €144, a cut of up to 10 million. Is that tax justice? Some 3 million being spent on special government advisers, many of which, including have family members, are paid in excess of promised limits, which equates to 300,000 home help hours. In my own constituency, Crave Kieran GA Club, for example, got nothing, while 195,000 went into Minister Riley's constituency. I ask, is that tax justice? A proposed €250,000 cut to the service of the blind and disabled children on Grace Park Road, Drumcondra, is now on the table. Is that tax justice for those families?
You have 2 minutes left.
Can your household afford to employ a tax consultant to reduce his or her tax bill? 40,000 senior citizens are about to lose their medical cards. Again, I ask these questions in this debate because the tax issue is a very important part of the legislation. The top 10,000 taxpayers each have an average income of €595,900. This was a reply given to Minister Noonan to a parliamentary question. Not a penny in wealth tax has been imposed, and these top earners will suffer the same reduction of €260 per year as a person on the minimum wage. These are all the real issues out there. That's why there's a lot of anger out there in relation to this finance bill. In Tallaght the other night, public sector staff were at boiling point because once again they were being punished for the actions of others. And they are right. Why should a nurse, a teacher, a guard or a firefighter or a young Garda suffer because of reckless bankers, regulators, some politicians and some developers? That's why I have such anger, and many must feel that the respect has gone out the window in relation to this issue. This week we have seen the debate going on about the Pro-Park agreement. I'm very worried about it because we have many misinformation out there. Many German public servants, for example, earn more than the Irish. The Public Accounts Committee says that many allowances are core pay. The Croke Park savings are not overestimated, and the CSO finds a narrowing gap between private and public sector. In relation to public sector pay, it's broadly in line with the comparable EU countries. There's many media reports out there that give the opposite impression. So what I say is, in this debate, there should be no divide and conquer coming from different people, politicians and ministers, in relation to this particular debate. And I'm very concerned about these issues that are raised. Finally, can I say, in relation to the excise section there, section 47 confirms the budget agrees on the rates of tobacco products and tax. Here we have a situation where we have major illegal smoking going on in cigarettes, and this is another concern of mine. And we also have the hammering again of small businesses and designated smoking areas being closing down, costing jobs and people's livelihoods.
Thank you, Deputy.
So finally, I want to welcome the opportunity to put this on the all record. It's important that we have an inclusive debate and we deal with these issues in a sensible way. Thank you.
Deputy Shane Ross.
Thank you,
You
Mr.
have
Gullah.
6 minutes.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to this bill, which I find a deeply depressing reflection of thinking, not so much of the government, but I think of the Department of Finance and the people who dictate their thought to them from elsewhere. You know, it's a kind of a monument to financial orthodoxy, and I suspect it's possibly the most conservative finance bill in the last 30 or 40 years. It's totally lacking in any imagination. It's totally lacking in any vision. It is certainly reflecting a conservative way of thinking, which does not reflect the sense of urgency and the vision which might be included in a measure of this sort. The problem I have with it, I suppose, is that it just comes back to all the same sources for income and for revenue. and looks very little further than that. You know, there was an opportunity in this budget and in this finance bill to embark upon a new model, to say to the Troika, all right, we acknowledge that we have to produce a certain amount of revenue to bridge the budget deficit. We acknowledge that there's a problem there, but allow us to do what we like within those parameters and within the projections we have. And indeed, anybody who's been to see the Troika, as virtually everybody in this House seems to have done now, seems to get a different interpretation from what they say and from what the government says. The government, when it's politically convenient, blames the Troika for the thinking behind the budget and the measures behind the budget. The Troika say, well, they can actually do what they like as long as the figures at the end, pretty roughly, measure up. Now, they do pretty roughly measure up. I don't dispute that. But the measures are the measures of financial orthodoxy. You know, I've been listening for a long time to my colleagues on this side of the House from the left. And I don't agree with very much of what they say. But I do find it far more challenging, and in some cases more convincing, to listen to Joe Higgins and Richard Boyd Barrett than I do to listen to John Moran and the Department of Finance. Because at least they are trying to portray a new model. I think they're wrong about their sums, but at least they are trying to portray a new model and a new way of doing things, not within those same parameters. And I listen to Deputy Boyd Barrett from time to time, talking what I don't believe is makes financial sense in the long run, when he talks about the multinationals. When he says there is a great pot of gold out there in the multinationals, if you go out there and tax them a lot more because they're not paying the right rates, if you tax them that much more, you get billions more for the exchequer, and you'll gradually bridge that gap. I don't agree with him, but I think he's put his finger on something quite interesting, which is that there is great potential in those multinationals, which are, after all, a kind of political grey area here, because people are treat them rather tenderly, encourage them in some ways, and then go and batter them on the head in others. My contention is this: they should be nurtured. They should be encouraged. And I don't know if anybody in the House remembers the budget of, I can't remember the date now.
Deputy, you have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, okay, it was a fit of full budget at some stage, where they actually reduced capital gains tax. And we know what happened when they reduced capital gains tax. Revenue rocketed. And I would suggest to the government that they would be thinking a little bit outside the box and looking at corporation tax, and I've said this before, and I say it again, and saying, okay, why don't we reduce that a bit? Because personally, I think it would bring in more of the big-ticket items that we so badly need. Whatever people feel ideologically about multinationals, they do certain things here. They brought in the Americans on their own, over 100,000 jobs, and on top of that, they bring in enormous spin-off activity in the economy. And I don't care as much as others obviously do, whether they're paying 0% or 12.5% or 33%. I just say the more of them, the better at the moment, because they'll produce more jobs and they'll produce activity in the community, which is so important and which is what they need. And the government appears to have absolutely no jobs policy whatsoever. You can't really have a jobs policy if you're doing what the mandarins tell you and what the Troika tell you. The only jobs policy I've seen from them is crucify the pensioners, put 0.6% levy on them and put it into some sort of mythical bucket elsewhere, which is going to produce jobs. That's part of their jobs policy. Their second jobs policy is emigration. And that's the kind of unsung government hero.
Thank you.
Because emigration sorts out unemployment in a very, very negative and very miserable way.
Thank you, Deputy.
It is not acceptable It is not acceptable that should be the safety valve for the government when they're preaching jobs and unemployment is one of the great problems of the economy.
Thank you. Thank you. The next deputies to speak is Deputy Donoghue, Fitzpatrick, McLaughlin and Keane, and you all have 5 minutes each. Deputy Donoghue.
Thank you very much, Last Count Corla. Just before I address a core point in relation to the finance bill, I do want to respond to a point there that my colleague Deputy Ross made. And as somebody who worked in a multinational company myself, and I know Deputy Ross is well aware of the importance of them to the sector, I just do want to point out to him that yesterday Facebook announced they're going to create another 100 jobs in the country. Point out to them that our balance of payments surplus is one of the best in all of Europe, despite the fact that we're in the kind of difficulty he knows so well, that our share of multinational investment versus what it should be is 2 to 3 times its size. We attract more multinational investment into our country than some of the very biggest economies and countries across Europe. So any kind of analysis that says that we're not attracting in enough multinational investment flies in the face of the fact that many of the very, very biggest companies are investing a huge amount already into our economy. And I understand the American Chamber of Commerce, I think it was yesterday, published a video entitled 12 Reasons to Invest in Ireland. So I think we should very clearly make the point that our country is already doing exceptionally well from a foreign direct investment point of view, and we want to do better. I do, however, want to return to an issue that's contained within the budget, though only touched on in the property bill, in the finance bill, but is the central theme of the last budget, which is the introduction of the new property tax system, and raise an issue that's very close to my own heart and indeed that of you, Last Count Corla, which is the issue of flooding in constituencies and the impact that this has on the value of their homes. And to make very clearly the point, Last Count Corla, that a flooded home for a resident, as you well know, is a calamity. I've been in situations where I've seen homeowners waist high in water, I've seen how upset they are, and I've seen the damage that's caused to their homes. And if I look at the communities that have been affected of that in my own constituency, the people of Ballybock, of Cabra, of East Wall, of North Strand and from Condra, parts of that community have been devastated by flooding and by repeated flooding. But unfortunately for many of them, once they've dealt with flooding, it's only the start of what then becomes a very, very difficult experience. Because they then face the experience of, firstly, not being able to get insurance for their homes, which means that when and if they're flooded again, they're frequently dealing with not being able to get insurance to deal with the last repairs they had to do, let alone the next repair that they have to do. And the second issue that they face is the reality of not being able to sell their homes. They can't sell them because of the flooding risk and the flooding that's happened in the past. Now, in fact, I was in a home recently in the North Strand area where I could see the damage in the property from the last time they were flooded a number of years ago. And they've been flooded again since then, and they're not able to get insurance from the last time they were flooded. Now, to bring this back to the core issue of the property tax that's contained in this bill, and I believe that this is an essential issue that the new property tax system must recognise. We cannot tax flooded properties or homes that could potentially be flooded at the value of unflooded homes. It will not be fair. If a house was flooded and if it faces the risk of flooding in the future, then it's simply worth less.
You have a minute left.
You have a minute left, thank you. It's simply worth less than a home that was not flooded and is unlikely to be flooded again in the future. And the property tax valuation model must make this distinction. If a property cannot get home insurance, then its market value is massively reduced. And the new system must recognise this. It's a market valuation system, so it should be coherent. It should be consistent. And if it should recognise that if factors beyond the influence of somebody mean the market value of their home is massively reduced, then that's what they should be taxed at. I've already raised this issue with the Department of Finance, and I'm raising this here now in the Dáil because it is vital that this issue be recognised. And what I want the government to do, and as a member of the government backbencher, I'll be pushing for this. We need to do one specific thing. We have to give specific guidance to residents who cannot get home insurance and face a flooding risk. They must know, firstly, that they will not be taxed for a value which their home does not have.
Thank you.
And secondly, that this is recognised by the Revenue Commissioner.
Thank you, Deputy.
Residents that I represent and that you represent were not flooded through any fault of their own, and we must not, through this system, add
Thank
to
you.
that plight.
Thank you. Deputy Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. The Finance Bill implements the taxation measures announced in the Budget 2013. In addition to introducing the tax increases announced on Budget Day, the bill builds upon the SME support introduced in the budget and includes a number of new measures to support SMEs. The SME sector will be the driver of the economic recovery across the country, and this government is committed to supporting this key sector. This is why the primary focus in Budget 2013 and the Finance Bill 2013 is on jobs, and specifically why the government prioritised the introduction of measures that will support the SME sector. The SMEs are the key providers of jobs across the country, and with 250,000 private sector jobs lost between 2008 and 2011, it is the SME sector that will lead the recovery in the domestic economy and will create the jobs to make the serious inroad on our all too high unemployment levels. Each of the measures included in the Finance Bill 2013 are designed to help this critical sector to trade, to go into the new products and markets, to sustain existing and to create new jobs. These initiatives will build upon the support that are available through government departments and agencies, and the measures introduced to support credit flow into the SME sector. The 10-point tax reform plan was introduced and announced in the budget. This plan included measures that will make a real difference for the SME sector, such as reforming the 3-year corporation tax relief for start-up companies, increasing the cash receipt basis threshold for VAT, amending the closed company surcharge to improve cash flow for SMEs, and extending the foreign earning deduction for work-related travel to certain additional countries. The Financial Bill 2013, which goes through the Oireachtas in the coming weeks, gives effect to the following measures announced on the budget day. It will give effect to the auto diesel excise duty relief for licensed and compliant hauliers. Also, following consideration, the relief will be extended to the licensed passenger transport sector. The relief will take place effective from the 1st of July 2013, and the amount of relief will be linked to the price of auto diesel. The maximum amount of relief will be 7.5 cents per litre. As well as being extended for a further 7 years, from 2014 to 2020, and announced in the budget, the employment and investment incentive is being amended to allow the operators or managing of hotels, guest houses and other self-catering accommodations to qualify, subject to review after 2 years. The hotel sector currently employs approximately 51,000 individuals. Extension of the incentive is to cover investment in this sector, which will help sustain the jobs and potentially create additional employment. This bill also provides for measures announced in the budget that to enable farm reconstruction, capital gain tax relief will be available where proceeds of a sale of a farmland are reinvested for reconstruction purposes. The relief will also apply to farmland swaps subject to certification by chatters for all transactions seeking relief. The commencement of the relief is subject to receipt of EU state-funded approval. The bill also gives effect that individuals will be allowed a once-off option to withdraw up to 30% of the value of the funded additional voluntary contribution (AVCs) made to supplemental retirement benefits. Withdrawal will be liable to tax at an individual marginal rate. The option to withdraw will be available up for 3 years from the passing of the bill. It is also provided for the changes to Universal Social Charge, the USC. Standard rates of the USC will apply to those aged 7 years of age and over, and medical card holders, both PAYE and self-employed income earners, who have income in excess of 60,000 per annum. The current lower 4% rate of the USC, which applies until the end of 2013, will continue in place of all other relevant income tax earners. The bill also continues an additional measure to improve the access of small and medium enterprises to the key employee provision of O&D tax credits. Under the current legislation, in order to qualify for the credit, an employee must spend at least 75% of the time working in O&D. This threshold is being reduced to 50% in order to assist SMEs to avail of this provision. On a daily basis in my constituency office in Dundalk, people are saying that Ireland is on the road to recovery. This was the biggest downturn in the history of the state. I commend this bill to the House. Go on, my God.
Thank you very much. Deputy Tom McLaughlin. Tony, you have 5 minutes, Tony.
For the short time that I have to speak, I would like to comment on a number of significant proposals as set out by Minister Noonan in this bill. And I do believe that these items will provide some opportunity for people, particularly in the tourism sector. The inclusion of hotels, guest houses and self-catering accommodation under the Employment and Investment Incentive Scheme is an example of such opportunities. The Finance Bill 2013 provides for an extension of the Employment and Investment Incentive Scheme until the end of 2020. As part of this extension, hotels, guest houses and self-catering accommodation will be allowed to qualify on a temporary basis where they meet the conditions of the incentive. This will cover investments in this sector, will help to sustain these jobs and potentially create additional employment. Recent budgets have seen sharp increases in the overall tax burden, and it is vital that we maintain a tax system which encourages investment. Targeted measures which support construction are welcome and provide in a small way a stimulus for the domestic economy. The higher VAT threshold, which shall rise from 1 million to 1.25 million, will give companies with a small turnover more time to pay VAT bills, which will improve the cash flow for many of these smaller businesses. I, like many of my colleagues, want to warmly welcome the return of the fuel excise rebate, which is very welcome for hauliers and also for bus and coach operators, which have been badly hit by the high cost of diesel. It will support job creation and growth by reducing the cost of moving goods and will give a further stimulus to tourism in the year of the gathering. I am glad to see that the rebate of 7.5 cent will only be available to properly licensed and tax compliant operators. It will help to prevent them from being undercut by other non-compliant operators. It is important to note that bus or coach operators currently cannot reclaim VAT on their fuel, and this imposes huge difficulties and profitability for these companies. The Minister, in framing this bill, had little option because of our current budgetary situation, and I welcome some of the initiatives around SMEs and some property tax incentives. In conclusion, I urge the Minister to look at ways and means in the 2014 Finance Bill to encourage more investment in the economy through tax reliefs that will put investment where it is needed, not like before, where tax incentives drove a false economy and were, in my view, a contribution to our property boom and bust disaster. Like the incentives in the middle 90s, driven by the Rainbow government, they need to have advantages for the taxpayer and the investors and become a stimulus to some sectors that need, and I look forward to some imaginative proposals in the 2014 budget, when hopefully our budgetary situation is better.
Thank you, Deputy Sean Keane, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. The main objective of this year's Finance Bill is obviously to continue the vital task of stabilising our state's finances, which are still unfortunately in a precarious position. Balancing the books and returning our nation to a sustainable footing is of paramount necessity, and as can be seen in this and previous finance bills, it is a task that is easier said than done. Widening our tax base so that we reduce our borrowing is vital and unavoidable. And it should not be difficult for anyone in this House to appreciate the substantial gap between our state's income and our state's expenditure, which currently requires borrowing of €1.2 billion per month. The Troika have also stated that it is their view as a country that we should need to broaden the tax base as well. Balancing the books is not enough on its own, however. If you look at the health sector, for example, recent experience over decades have seen a huge increase in spending but has shown that substantial spending does not on its own lead to better outcomes, and smarter, more effective and more targeted ways of working and achieving results are essential. While the finance bill contains measures to widen the tax base, and let's be honest, increased taxes are never popular, the bill also has a clear focus and purpose to it. Revenue-raising measures are accompanied by new vigour and emphasis on positive actions in areas and which will speed up our return to sustainability. The 10-point plan, for example, for medium to small-sized businesses will collectively support job creation initiatives, which in turn will reduce the pressure on our social protection budget. The plan will help small to medium-sized companies reduce administration costs, protect and enhance cash flow, and extend the foreign earnings deduction for work-related travel, which is essential for building export links. Another welcome initiative is Section 20, which extends the tax relief programme for the film industry. And I would appeal to the Minister to examine extending the relief further to other creative industries such as gaming, or cities such as my own area of Galway and indeed Dublin are fast becoming locations of choice for this rapidly growing industry. And I believe we can and should encourage our Irish entrepreneurs by supporting the development of an indigenous Irish industry alongside, of course, the multinationals, which are very, very welcome. On the issue of multinationals, Section 31 of the bill is also very relevant. It concerns the agreement between Ireland and the US regarding the system to improve our international tax compliance, which also facilitates recognition of US accounting standards as mentioned in last year's company amendment bill. Such innovation ensures we can reduce and minimise red tape and bureaucracy whilst prioritising job creation. I'm also heartened to see the inclusion in the bill of another issue which I and many others have raised with Minister Noonan, covered by Section 16, which enables citizens to make a once-off withdrawal of up to 30% of the value of a pension created through ABCs. And I know this has come up at time as well in the Jobs Committee, of which I'm a member. A measure of this obviously required careful consideration, and a balance was needed in terms of assisting citizens experiencing financial difficulties and at the same time protecting the provision they are making for their retirement. And hopefully this measure will help consumer spending and also allow family members to be helped out if that is the desire of the person withdrawing from the ABC. Obviously, in terms of farming, of which I have a great knowledge, I welcome the initiatives that the Minister has taken in terms of stock relief. We have huge problems within agriculture, the fact that there's more farmers now over 80 than under 35, and I welcome the initiatives taken. In terms of the framing of this budget, obviously it must be transparent and fair, and the Finance Bill builds upon the verified fact that our tax system is one of the most progressive in Europe. It's confirmed by the OECD, the SRI and the European Commission. Whilst the Finance Bill by necessity widens our tax base, it also contains further measures to ensure that those most able to contribute to restoring our nation's finances do so. And these include such initiatives as the requirement that those older citizens with income in excess of 60,000 pay the standard rate of USC.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes left.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, beg your pardon. The abolition of top slicing relief for lump sum payments of over 200,000 and the increase by 3% in dirt tax, capital gains tax, and to bring this rate up to 33%. These measures and others ensure that we can protect and maintain the social welfare payments and not increase tax bands or rates, which was a commitment given. The sense of fairness is continued in Section 97, which includes the necessary legislative changes to facilitate the Personal Insolvency Bill, a bill which is central to alleviating the serious problem of mortgage arrears, an issue which is being debated this week under private members. I also welcome, as other speakers have done so, the initiatives to help hauliers and those within the passenger transport companies to allow them to remain competitive and to protect and grow their businesses. And it's in some cases, and I know that they have had a lot of lobbying of deputies in terms of the cost-neutral basis of this, certainly for the hauliers. In summary, I think the Finance Bill gives effect to what was a pro-jobs budget. I believe it sets in train a process of ensuring that we broaden our tax base and enact sustainable or ensure sustainable funding sources for our local authorities. I think that's very important in terms of those, as most of us are former members of local authorities know too well. And I see this bill as the latest in a series of finance bills and those planned by this government to restore economic sovereignty, and I certainly welcome the initiatives.
Thank you very much.
Chairman.
Next speaker is Deputy John McGuinness, and you have 20 minutes.
Look, I firstly want to maybe reflecting on what some of the previous speakers have touched on in relation to small businesses throughout the country, and to say that there are certainly measures within the finance bill and were measures within the budget that will positively impact on those businesses, and I acknowledge that. I also wish to acknowledge the change introduced in this finance bill in relation to the diesel rebate. As someone whose background was haulage and transport, I can appreciate the necessity for the diesel rebate, and I know that in terms of costs it will impact down the line to the cost of delivering the services to the customers, be they here or up and down the country. And I welcome the fact also that that diesel rebate has now been extended to bus operators and tour operators, those that are central, if you like, to transport operations in the country, and they will undoubtedly feel the benefit of those changes. But when you look back on what happened before the budget, in the lead up to the budget, and indeed what's happening in our country today, you can't help but highlight the fact in a debate about the finance bill that finance through the banks is simply not being made available. And I've said this time and time again, Minister Perry was in the chamber when I said it, that small businesses are not receiving the type of support that you would expect from the banks, particularly given that they have been allocated so much money year on year to support the SME sector. And to this day, what is happening in the banks is nothing short of restructuring. They're restructuring the term loans, they're restructuring overdrafts, and in some cases, they're withdrawing overdraft facilities. If that wasn't the case, because there's conflicting, if you like, views on this, but if it wasn't the case, well, we wouldn't need the Credit Review Office. The banks would be functioning, everything would be grand. The business person, the young entrepreneur would be getting the money that he or she requires. But it isn't the case. And the government must say to the banks that it isn't the case, and that they need to do much more for enterprises up and down the country, and that they need to focus on those family businesses and those that are employing a small number of people that are based in every parish in the country. And they're not doing that. And we are giving them taxpayers' money, which in my opinion is doing nothing more than going directly to their bottom line to correct their balance sheet. But they're not one bit interested in the enterprise that's out there trying to attempt to correct its own balance sheet with the help of the bank. That's what banks are for. And they are an absolute disgrace that they ignore the representative bodies and businesses up and down the country, and they ignore the government, and they continue to reconstruct themselves, so at some stage in the game they will be out of the control of government, although that won't be for a long time with one or two of those banks, and then they'll go on business as usual in the way they used to do it. But that will not be the case. They need to do for business now what needs to be done. And I make that point, and I would ask again that ministers and that the government listen carefully to the SME sector. If we look at what government is doing, and we've listed out the benefits now to the haulage and transport operators, you try and renew your haulage licence urgently. You need another truck added to your licence because you have a job, you have a contract, things are picking up and moving on. Just try it someday. It will not happen overnight. It will be put into a pile that will be dealt with, and this is to quote officials from that department, in due course. I ask you, Minister, to find out from those officials, what do they mean by in due course? Have they no respect for the fact that perhaps in due course that business or contract may no longer be available to the haulier, and the licence and the renewal and the addition of a vehicle and the creation of a job or two might not be available to that contractor anymore. So perhaps in due course might be given a different urgency. Perhaps they should be told that they need to urgently review the renewal of those licences or the addition of vehicles onto those licences, because jobs depend on it. And they're ignoring the pleas of individual enterprises to have this matter dealt with expeditiously. They ignore it. And I'm asking you to take note of this fact, and perhaps somebody in there will bring about some change in how this is being dealt with within that department. If you look at another side of the SME sector, a big issue for yourselves in government was the commitment that you made in relation to upward-only rent reviews. Now, I'm a landlord. I understand how difficult it is to do all of this in terms of legislation. There is not a private landlord in the country that hasn't been approached by tenants, whether the lease is long or medium term, to reduce the rent. Because from 2006 onwards, the collapse began. And anyone that looked at their costs, looked at their rent, their lease, their obligations under that lease, and the appeals to the landlord. Most sensible landlords set aside the upward-only rent review, and most sensible landlords reduced the rent. Now, there are many significant companies in this country who are locked into upward-only rent reviews, and they have failed to get the landlord to see common sense. And I would appeal to the department again to look at this and establish some way of getting the landlord forced into, if necessary, a review of that upward-only rent review clause. And I would ask the government to lead by example. I have been told, for example, that Shannon Development holds 43 leases with upward-only rent review clauses, that the IDA holds 74 leases, of which 63 have upward-only rent review clauses. The Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine have 70 leases, 90% of which have upward-only rent review clauses. And Oireachtas na Gaeltachta have a considerable number running into hundreds, and I'm sure a significant number of upward-only rent review clauses. And I draw the Minister's attention to one particular individual in Donegal who sent the keys back of his premises in an envelope to the Minister, Minister Coveney, because he couldn't negotiate new terms, new rent levels, to reflect the true value of the rent in the marketplace. And I'm asking that the Minister or the Taoiseach, because this man here actually wrote to the Taoiseach, and he asked him deliberately to intervene because jobs were at stake, his mortgage was at stake, and his business was at stake. Since then, he's closed his business, he's gone on the dole, a young entrepreneur, finished up, wound up by the government and its attitude towards its own properties and its own upward-only rent reviews. So therefore, there is a case to be answered. This is not pie in the sky. This is me reading from a letter to Mr. Kenny, citing the example of a small businessman who is a true businessman. They are trying to make ends meet, and he's only one example of many. One example of many. And when you consider that in most of the ports in the country controlled by the Minister for Agriculture, in terms of the property, an awful lot of the units have been closed, some for up to 10 years. So will the state get up off its behind and try and do something for enterprise and for solving these problems, so that those that are in employment can at least continue in employment, willing to pay a rent, but not the daft rents of many years ago? They need to be reviewed, and the state should lead its way and do something for them. I'll give you another example of the SME sector and how it's treated. Highbank Orchards in Kilkenny, a small microbrewery, a craft cider maker. And what you did in the budget in terms of excise duty, you increased it from 47 to 57 a 22% increase. Well, the last time in 2002 that this happened, where there was a substantial increase in excise duty, the consumption of cider or the sale of cider fell by 11.3%. Now, why can't we redefine what this man's business is so that it equates to the same definition as the small microbreweries, and that they get similar reliefs within that industry? Because you have this man here who employs 30 people, all of the apples are grown in Ireland, supporting a further 200 jobs. Now, surely we have to think of those people. Surely we have to understand that, yes, all of the other concessions that we gave, the tax reliefs and so on, they sometimes only apply to exporting companies or to niche markets such as research and development. And we completely forget our indigenous sector that is creating and sustaining jobs in this country at huge effort to families, at huge effort to family-run businesses and businesses that are run on an individual basis, but creating sustainable jobs. And we think, without a whisper, that you can increase this man's problem by 22%. It's an utter disgrace, and it should have been challenged here in the finance bill. There should be some line put into it that would give that man and that industry some sort of relief. They are, after all, Irish businesses creating Irish jobs, and they're exporting if at all possible. And it isn't too late for the government to introduce the amendment, because regardless of what kind of circus we go through here in this House or down in the committees, you, the government, have a substantial majority, and you can, if you want, introduce the appropriate amendment that deals with that simple issue, and I believe that you should. It affects small jobs in Ireland, and we need to indicate our absolute support for them. In terms of the vintners, just to touch on another group of people that exist in every single parish in the country, and they made representations to all sorts of TDs, senators, across all political parties, because their business is dying on its feet. You know it, Minister, you call to any establishment in the country, and you will find that they are not doing the same turnover as they used to do. They're paying their water in, water out at €3 a cubic metre, and contributing substantially to the local economy. They made recommendations here because their trade is affected by off-licence and so on. And why not introduce a system where the greater your turnover in terms of your off-licence activity, that's what your tax and that's what your licence renewal fee is based on? They made simple, sound suggestions. And I'm not backing up any single industry. It just happens that these are small businesses that are good examples of how government policy affects them in a negative way. Look at each and every one of them and the rates that they pay to local authorities. The rates that they pay. Another government-imposed tax that could have been addressed in the context of this budget. Why not introduce a bill that would allow each and every one of those businesses a self-assessment system, whereby they would have themselves assessed and the rates then would maybe come down? Because the rateable valuation system will not touch any of these businesses for another 5 or 6 years. And they cannot be allowed to wait for that. They won't have that sort of time. They don't have it. And yet, that cost imposed on them by the local authorities continues at a level that is unbearable in terms of small enterprises up and down the country. Why not turn around and do something for them? Why not turn around and introduce that system, simple as it is, with appropriate guidelines and penalties if someone decides to take advantage of it, and ensure that their rates are revalued and that their contribution continues, but at a lower level? That is something that could be done without a problem, and yet there's no response from the government in relation to that. I want to touch on the other issue of the PRSI, the contributions that will be taken from rental income in the future. You'd have all of the tax initiatives have now been done away with. So people who were into developing properties, who looked upon it as not so much a development, but as their pensions. These are the people that are being penalised. Now they're going to be taxed further through a new initiative from the government. And they'll pay their property tax, they'll pay their rates, where the rates have to be paid instead of the property tax. So anyone that's making an effort, anyone that's out there attempting to do business, is actually being penalised, left, right and centre. And the government boasts about its support for the SME sector. Well, I don't know many of those SMEs that have felt the benefit of anything that you did in the budget or through this finance bill. They haven't. Even the concession that you gave on cashing in the pension won't apply to the self-employed. And they're the very people that you're expecting to grow the economy. Speaker after speaker here said that we rely on the SME sector. In its day, it created 800,000 or 900,000 jobs. In America, they talk about the single entrepreneur being the person to lead the way out of their economic difficulties. And we, in a much smaller way, are exactly the same. We heap praise every single day on them, and yet we do nothing to help them. And I acknowledged earlier on what you did in relation to the business initiatives you took in this budget. But when you get down to the individual employer, when you get down to the family that's working its petrol pumps or its pub or its off-licence or its haulage company or any other cleaning service or anything that you can think of that is small, that is supportive of jobs within a local economy or a local parish, they will not feel one single benefit from this budget, except that you will take more and more money from their employees and from them as employers. I appeal to you today, Minister, you're familiar with business, is to reconsider some aspects of this finance bill and to give them a break, and to understand what's happening out there. Because what seems to be going on here in this House is that when we get here for the Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we're in a bubble, and we actually forget the real dilemma that people find themselves in out there. There is that of mortgage arrears, mortgage debt, personal debt, negative equity. You hear it every single week at your clinic.
The Deputy has 2 minutes.
You hear businesses complain every single week at your clinic, and they're feeling no relief from it. And when you introduce the property tax, which is another example of just the disconnect that exists between here and the people that we represent. Now, we can argue whether Fianna Fáil had it in an agreement with the Troika or not, and you're now the ones that have to introduce it. That's a political argument. But let's look at the reality. They can't afford to pay for your septic tank charge. They complained about that. They can't afford the household charge. And you're going to introduce a property tax now, where the revenue will require another 100 people to operate it. It's the wrong tax and it's the wrong time. People do not have the money to pay it. And it's a further nail in the coffin of some people out there in terms of their finances that this should be imposed upon them at this rate. There is still time to review this bill in terms of the supports that are necessary for the SME sector. There is still time to address the issues that I have raised in relation to the examples that I've given. And I ask you to ask your teacher to look at that letter from that man in Donegal. It is a complaint, it is a suggestion, but it is a true story, similar to the issue in relation to cider manufacturing or haulage, or the imposition of bureaucracy and red tape, which the government for the last 20 years have said, oh, we've reduced the burden of red tape, we've reduced the cost of business. Ask anyone in business and they'll tell you it costs them a considerable amount in terms of administration to keep their show on the road. And the smaller it is, the more difficult it is. And you'll find in each of those cases some family member that is working double the hours every week in order to keep some employment in the local parish.
Thank you, Deputy. The next speaker is the Minister himself, John Perry, and you're sharing your time with Deputy Noel Harrington. Both have 10 minutes each.
Thank you very much indeed, that's the hero. Before I just we're going to prepare a script just on Deputy McGuinness's point there with regards to his confidence and credit, and obviously that you must remember the legacy that we inherited, and miracles take a while longer. And it was no rubbish at all. But we just see this the point. When I can tell you, you want to reply with the